The nurse looked up from her clipboard, saw my face, and went pale. "Mr. Marsh, your son told us not to call you. He said you two weren't speaking right now." I hadn't said a word to her yet. I was standing 8 feet away in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, still wearing my work boots from the garden, and my wife of 41 years was somewhere behind the doors she kept glancing at like she'd said too much already. "Where is my wife?" I said, and my voice didn't sound like mine. The nurse's hand tightened on the clipboard. "Sir, I think you need to sit down. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, I read every one of them. And a quick note before we start, this story blends real patterns of elder financial abuse with details adapted for narrative purposes. Names, places, and certain events have been changed or dramatized for storytelling. If that's not the kind of thing you enjoy, no hard feelings, there's no shortage of other things to watch tonight. But if you're the kind of person who believes the people closest to you can still surprise you in ways you never wanted to learn, stay with me. This one starts slow. It doesn't stay that way. My name is Edwin Marsh. I'm 71 years old, and for 38 years I worked as a structural engineer, which is a fancy way of saying I spent my career figuring out why buildings fall down before they actually fall down. You learn to read stress. You learn that the crack in the wall is never really about the wall. It's about what's underneath it, pressing up, looking for the weak point. I didn't know, on the Tuesday morning this story really begins, that I was about to spend the next 4 months applying everything I knew about failing structures to my own family. Norma and I had been married 41 years. We met at a community college night class. She was studying to be a dental hygienist. I was retaking college algebra because I'd flunked it the first time around and was too proud to admit it to my parents. She used to say she fell for me because I was the only man in the room who didn't try to explain the material to her before the professor did. We bought our house on Larkspur Lane in 1987, raised 1 son in it, buried 1 dog in the backyard under the maple tree, and had planned, the way people plan when they've got nothing but time stretched out in front of them, to grow old there together and let our son Kyle and his wife inherit a house that didn't owe anybody anything. Kyle was 39 that spring. He'd had a rough decade, a divorce in his early 30s that gutted him, a business that failed, 2 years of couch surfing that Norma and I never talked about outside our own bedroom because we didn't want him to feel like a case study. Then he met Paige. Paige Calloway, 34, worked in wealth consulting, which I never fully understood and never pushed him to explain, because for the first time in a decade my son looked like a man standing up straight. They married 18 months before this story starts. Norma cried at the wedding, the good kind of crying, and I remember standing at the reception thinking, we got him back. I actually thought those words. We got him back. I want you to hold on to that thought, because it matters later. Not because I was wrong about loving him. Because I was wrong about what loving him meant. I owed my own judgment. The first sign, if I'm honest with myself now, came about 4 months before the hospital. Norma started getting tired in a way that didn't fit her. She'd always been the early riser in our marriage, up at 6, garden gloves on by 6:15, and that spring she started sleeping until 8, sometimes 9, complaining of headaches that never quite localized to one place. Our family doctor, a kind, overworked man named Dr. Okafor, ran the standard panel, found nothing alarming, and told her, the way doctors tell people our age everything, that it was probably stress, maybe early signs of anemia, keep an eye on it. Kyle and Paige had started coming around more by then, almost every week, which we took, at the time, as nothing but a blessing. Paige would bring homemade soup. Kyle would mow the lawn without being asked. They'd sit with us on the back porch in the evenings and Paige would ask Norma question after gentle question about her health, her medications, whether we'd ever set up a formal estate plan. "You two have worked so hard your whole lives," she said one evening, refilling Norma's iced tea before Norma had even noticed it was low. "It would break my heart if anything happened and things got complicated for you." I remember thinking, what a thoughtful girl. I want that on the record, because it matters what I believed before I knew better. A man my age likes to imagine he's sharp enough to spot a con from across a room. I want you to know I wasn't. I was exactly as blind as anyone would have been, sitting on my own porch, drinking sweet tea, watching my son laugh again for the first time in 10 years. Then came the Tuesday. It was 6:52 in the morning when Norma didn't come down for coffee. I found her on the bathroom floor, conscious but disoriented, her speech slurred at the edges like a tape running slow, one side of her face slack in a way that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. I called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and the paramedics, two young men who moved with a calm that I was grateful for and terrified by in equal measure, had her on oxygen and in the back of the ambulance in under 9 minutes. I followed in my truck, running 2 lights I have no memory of running, and by the time I got to Cedar Ridge Medical Center, Norma was already behind double doors marked staff only, and I was standing in a waiting room asking a receptionist question she couldn't answer. I called Kyle from that waiting room. It went to voicemail. I called again 20 minutes later. Voicemail. I texted, "Mom is in the ER at Cedar Ridge. Come now." Nothing. For 3 hours I sat in a plastic chair answering intake questions about Norma's medications and allergies from memory, my hands cold, my mind doing the thing minds do in hospitals, running through every version of a future I didn't want. At 11:14, a nurse, a young woman named Dana, I'd learn her name later, though at the time she was just a badge and a kind, nervous face, came out to update me. That's when it happened. That's the moment at the top of this story. I stood up when she came through the doors, and before I could even ask my question, she looked at me and said the sentence that has not left my head since. "Mr. Marsh, your son told us not to call you. He said you two weren't speaking right now." I want to walk you through what that sentence does to a person, because it isn't one feeling. It's 3, arriving at once, stacked on top of each other like a car wreck you see coming and can't stop. The first feeling is confusion, Kyle and I hadn't thought about anything. The second is fear, cold and immediate, because if my son told a hospital not to call me, that means my son had already been here, already been asked, already made a decision about whether I got to know my wife was in the hospital. And the third feeling, the one that took longest to arrive and stayed the longest once it did, was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. A crack in a wall. The kind I used to get paid to notice before anyone else saw it. "I'm her husband," I said. "I'm listed as her emergency contact. I'm standing right here. Where is my wife?" Dana's face did something complicated, professional training fighting against plain human decency, and decency won. "She's stable," she said, lowering her voice. "She had what looks like a mild ischemic event, but Mr. Marsh, I have to be honest with you, some of her lab values don't match a typical stroke presentation. Dr. Renner wants to run additional panels. Your son was here about an hour ago. He filled out some paperwork and told the front desk you two were estranged and he had medical power of attorney. I only found out that wasn't true when I saw your ID. I'm going to stop here and tell you something that only becomes clear looking backward. Kyle did not have medical power of attorney. Norma and I had never signed anything like that for either of our children, because we'd never needed to, because we were 71 and 68 and reasonably healthy and hadn't gotten around to the unpleasant business of planning for the day one of us couldn't speak for the other. My son had walked into a hospital, told a lie about a document that did not exist, and told a stranger that his own father was estranged from his mother, all within an hour of her being wheeled through the emergency doors. And then he had left. He was not in the building when I arrived. Nobody had seen him since. I asked Dana one more question before she had to get back to her rounds. What was in the paperwork he filled out? She hesitated, glanced down the hallway, and said something I wouldn't fully understand the waiter for another 2 weeks. He was asking about her code status. Whether she had a living will on file. And he left a card, an estate consultant's card, and asked if the hospital could have someone from their office contact him if her condition changed. I stood in that hallway for a long time after Dana went back through the double doors. I remember the fluorescent lights humming. I remember an old man across the waiting room watching a muted television with the particular patience of someone who has been in that chair before and knows how long these mornings can stretch. I remember thinking, very clearly, in the flat, procedural voice I used to use walking a construction site, something here does not carry its load. Find out what. If you're with me so far, if this story has your attention the way it had mine that morning, comment the word hallway below so I know you're still here. It matters to me more than you'd think. I was allowed in to see Norma at 1:40 that afternoon. She was groggy, one side of her mouth still not entirely cooperating, but she squeezed my hand and managed, in a voice thick with medication, to say my name. I sat with her for 2 hours, watched her sleep, watched the monitors do their slow green work, and did not leave her side again for the rest of that day. Kyle did not call. Paige did not call. At 6:30 that evening, a text finally came through from Kyle. Dad, so sorry, just saw your messages, my phone died. On my way now. He arrived at 8:15, nearly 10 hours after his mother had been admitted, wearing a suit like he'd come from a meeting, and hugged me at the door of her room with an ease that, looking back, I understand now was practiced. Practiced the way a man practices a handshake before a job interview. How's Mom? He asked, not looking at me, looking at her. You tell me, I said. You were here before I was. He went very still. Just for a second. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely, a flicker, the kind of pause a man takes when he's deciding which version of the truth to hand you. I stopped by on my lunch, he said. I didn't want to wake you up before we knew anything. I should have called. The nurse said you told them we were estranged. She said you claimed medical power of attorney. Kyle laughed, and it was a real laugh, easy and light, which is the thing that unsettled me most. A liar who fumbles is easy to catch. A liar who laughs, comfortable, unbothered, already 3 moves ahead, that's a different animal entirely. Dad, there's obviously been some miscommunication with the front desk. I was worried and I probably said something garbled. I don't have power of attorney. Why would I say that? I didn't have an answer for him that night. I want to be honest with you about that, because this isn't a story where I was 3 steps ahead of everyone from the beginning. I went home that night and told myself the same thing 100,000 people tell themselves every year when the first crack appears in the wall, it's probably nothing. He's stressed. People say strange things in emergency rooms. I want you to remember that feeling, because if you've ever felt it yourself, that specific, quiet talking yourself down, I need you to know it's usually your instincts trying to get a word in edgewise before your hope shouts them down. Norma came home 4 days later with a diagnosis that didn't sit right in my chest the way a diagnosis should. Dr. Renner, a careful, soft-spoken cardiologist who'd taken over her case once the neurological workup came back inconclusive, sat us both down before discharge. Mrs. Marsh, your symptoms and your labs don't perfectly match a typical stroke, she said. Your potassium was elevated on admission in a way we don't usually see with ischemic events. I'd like you to follow up with your primary care doctor and consider a broader toxicology screen if these symptoms recur. I'm not trying to alarm you. I just want you watched closely. I wrote that phrase down on a napkin in my jacket pocket before we even left the parking garage. Elevated potassium. Toxicology screen. Not a stroke, not exactly. My engineering brain, the one that spent 38 years hunting for the real cause behind the visible crack, would not let that phrase go. 2 weeks passed. Norma improved slowly, still tired, still occasionally dizzy, but improving. Kyle and Paige came by twice during those 2 weeks, both times with flowers, both times full of warm concern, both times steering the conversation, gently, patiently, toward the same handful of topics. Had we thought about updating our wills? Had we considered whether the house was too much house for 2 people our age? Whether it might be smart, just as a precaution, to set up some kind of power of attorney in case something like this happens again and you two can't speak for yourselves? Paige said that last part with her hand resting on Norma's arm, her voice soft as a lullaby, and I watched my wife nod along, grateful, trusting, exhausted from her hospital stay and glad to have her son's wife looking after her. I didn't say anything that week. I want to be honest about that too. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a man who spends his life looking for structural failure eventually starts seeing cracks in things that are perfectly sound. But I started keeping a small notebook in my nightstand drawer, the kind you'd use for a grocery list, and I started writing dates in it. Just dates, at first. The day of the hospital. The day of the flowers. The day Paige mentioned power of attorney for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. The break came on a Thursday evening, 19 days after the hospital, when I went looking for my reading glasses in the study and found Kyle's laptop bag sitting on the desk chair, left behind after a visit 2 days earlier. It wasn't locked, wasn't hidden, just sitting there the way a man leaves things behind when he trusts the room he's leaving them in. And sitting on top of the folders inside, half visible through the mesh pocket, was a business card. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind of card a man pays extra for because he wants you to believe in him before he's said a word. Gordon Blackwell. Senior Estate Strategist. Heritage Family Advisors. And beneath it, in Kyle's handwriting on the back, for words that stopped my heart in my chest, talk to Dad Sunday. I didn't touch anything else that night. I put the card back exactly where I found it, the way you learn to leave evidence untouched when you've spent a career documenting failures for insurance investigators and litigation attorneys, and I sat down at the kitchen table with my notebook and wrote everything down while it was fresh. Then I did something I'm not proud of, and something I'd do again in a heartbeat. I opened the laptop. I want to pause here and tell you plainly, some of the events from this point forward were pieced together across several weeks, and for the sake of the story I'm compressing that timeline. But every discovery I'm about to describe to you actually happened, in one order or another, and every document I found became part of a case file that would eventually sit on a prosecutor's desk. If that kind of detail interests you, stay with me. If this is starting to feel like more than you signed up for tonight, that's all right too. You can step away here with no hard feelings, and I appreciate you making it this far. The laptop wasn't password protected on the login screen. Kyle had it set to open straight to his desktop, the way people do when they've never imagined their own father would be the one sitting in front of it. I found his email client already logged in. I am not, generally, a man who reads other people's mail. But I had a business card in my pocket that said "Talk to Dad Sunday," and a wife whose potassium had spiked in a way no one could explain, and 38 years of training that told me the surface story and the real story are rarely the same building. The subject line stopped me cold: Marsh Estate, timeline update. The thread went back 6 weeks. Gordon Blackwell to Kyle. Kyle to Gordon Blackwell. And, 3 messages down, a name I didn't recognize at first, a woman named Renata Vale, sees it on nearly every message, referred to twice in the thread simply as P. I read for 40 minutes straight, my coffee going cold beside me, my hand steady in the specific way hands go steady when the fear has moved past panic and into something colder and more useful. Blackwell's opening message, from 6 weeks earlier, read, Kyle, per our call, current estimated value of the Larkspur property is $780K based on comps, plus an estimated $400K in combined retirement and investment accounts per the documents page was able to review. Total estate north of 1.1 M. If we can get the health issue established as a documented pattern within 60 to 90 days, we have a clean path to guardianship petition or, preferable, voluntary POA transfer. Your mother's cardiac history gives us a natural narrative. Let's discuss dosing timeline on our call Thursday. I read that sentence 4 times. Dosing timeline. I want you to sit with those 2 words the way I had to sit with them at my own kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, because I did not understand, in that moment, what I was actually looking at. I understood the money. I understood the plan to take the house, the accounts, the 41 years Norma and I had built stone by stone the same way I'd once watched Sylvia, no, forgive me, I mean the way I'd watched Norma, plant roses along a fence line we built together one October weekend. What I did not yet understand was that dosing wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't about paperwork at all. Kyle's reply, sent 2 days later, understood. Mom's already on a diuretic for the blood pressure. Paige says the potassium supplement swap is basically undetectable if we keep doses low and spread out. Slow enough that Dr. Okafor writes it off as age. We're not trying to hurt her, just get her declared incompetent enough that Dad has to accept help managing things. Once we have POA we can move faster on the rest. I sat back from the screen. I remember, very specifically, the sound the chair made against the kitchen floor, because it was the only sound in the house, and it seemed impossibly loud. My son had just written, in his own words, in an email he never imagined his father would read, that he and his wife had been altering my wife's medication in a way designed to make her sick enough, but not too sick, to strip away her legal capacity to make her own decisions. Not trying to hurt her, he'd written, as if that sentence erased the sentence before it. As if there were a version of slowly poisoning your mother that counted as gentle. I want you to know something about grief, because what I felt sitting at that table wasn't only fear. It was grief, arriving early, for a son I had not yet lost but somehow already understood I was going to have to lose in one form or another. I sat there until nearly 2 a.m. reading the rest of the thread. I learned that P was Paige. I learned that Paige had a working relationship with Gordon Blackwell that predated her marriage to my son by at least 2 years, based on the casual, familiar tone of their earliest emails. I learned that Blackwell's firm, Heritage Family Advisors, had no listing with the state bar, no complaint history I could find because it apparently had no real history at all, no reviews outside its own polished website, no Better Business Bureau file, nothing. And I learned, in an email from Paige to Kyle sent 11 months earlier, before I had ever properly met her, a sentence that told me everything I needed to know about who I was actually dealing with. Gordon says this one's cleaner than the Ohio job. Older couple, no other kids to interfere, decent equity, and the wife's already got a cardiac history we can work with. Should move faster than last time. Last time. I read those 2 words until they stopped looking like English. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, comment the word still here, because what I'm about to tell you next is the part where I stopped being a frightened old man reading his son's email at midnight, and started being something closer to what I used to be on a job site, a man who finds the crack, traces it to its source, and does not stop until he knows exactly how much weight the structure can bear before it fails completely. I did not confront Kyle that night. I want to be honest that every instinct in me wanted to. I wanted to drive to his house and put that laptop screen in front of his face and demand an explanation. But I had spent 38 years of my professional life learning one hard lesson about structural failure. The moment you show your hand to the people responsible for the damage, they start hiding the evidence. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it. I put the business card back in the mesh pocket, angled the same way it had been. And the next morning, before Kyle came by to retrieve his bag, I drove Norma to see Dr. Okafor and, without telling her why, asked for a full toxicology and metabolic panel, paid out of pocket, sent to an independent lab across town rather than the hospital system Kyle had already inserted himself into. I also did something else that morning that would matter more than I understood at the time. I called an old friend from my engineering days, a woman named Priya Shah who'd left structural work 15 years ago to open a computer and electronics repair shop 3 towns over, the kind of place where half her business was recovering photos off dead hard drives for grieving families and the other half was teenagers who'd cracked their phone screens. Priya and I had worked 2 forensic litigation cases together back in the 90s, back when digital forensics barely existed as a phrase, and she had never once, in 30 years, been anything but precise, careful, and utterly unshockable. "Edwin Marsh," she said when I walked into her shop that Friday afternoon, "you look like a man who found something he wishes he hadn't." "I need you to look at something," I said, "and I need you to not ask me why until you've seen it." I told her everything, sitting in the back room of her shop surrounded by motherboards and the smell of solder. I showed her photographs I'd taken of the emails on my phone. I hadn't dared to forward anything through Kyle's actual account, worried he'd noticed the activity, and I watched her face change the way a person's face changes when they go from professional curiosity to genuine alarm. "Edwin," she said slowly, "this isn't a custody dispute over a house. This reads like a template. Someone's run this play before." She turned her monitor toward me and typed Heritage Family Advisors into a search bar, then Gordon Blackwell Estate Consultant, then, on a hunch, Renata Vale plus half a dozen city names. On the 4th search, a forum post came up, 3 years old, mostly deleted, but partially preserved in a cache. A woman in Ohio writing about a Renata who had married into her family, befriended her aging father-in-law, and then vanished with nearly $600,000 in liquidated retirement accounts after the old man was declared legally incompetent following what the Post called a series of unexplained health scares. The post had been taken down. Priya found it anyway, the way she'd always found things other people assumed were gone for good. "This is not your son acting alone," Priya said quietly. "This is your son married into something. I don't know if he understands the size of what he's part of. But somebody built this operation before they ever met your family." I drove home that night with a knot in my chest that never fully loosened for the next 3 months. The toxicology results came back 6 days later. Dr. Okafor called me personally, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Mr. Marsh, your wife's sample shows a pattern consistent with intentional oversupplementation of potassium chloride, combined with her existing diuretic. Individually, either substance is manageable. Together, over a sustained period, they can produce exactly the kind of cardiac and neurological symptoms your wife experienced. I need to ask you directly, is there any reason to believe someone in your household has had unsupervised access to Mrs. Marsh's medication?" I did not answer him honestly that day. I told him I needed to look into some things at home and asked him, please, to document everything in her chart and hold off on notifying anyone else until I called him back. Then I sat in my truck in the clinic parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. That evening I installed 4 small cameras throughout the house, one in the kitchen disguised as a smoke detector, one in the front hallway built into an old picture frame Norma had never liked and wouldn't miss if it went slightly crooked, one in the pantry where the medications were kept, tucked behind a box of oatmeal, and one covering the driveway from the garage eave. I am not a man who understood cloud storage or motion-triggered alerts before that week. Priya walked me through the setup over the phone twice, patiently, the way you'd walk a frightened man through anything, and by midnight the system was live, syncing to an account only I could access. Then I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I told Norma I needed her to trust me without explanation for a little while, and I told Kyle, calmly, over the phone the next day, that Norma and I were going to visit her sister for a week to get some rest after everything. We did not go to her sister's. We checked into a motel 11 miles from our own house, under my name, no reason to hide since Kyle had no idea what I already knew, and I told Norma everything I'd found that same night, sitting on the edge of a motel bed with the television off and her hand gripping mine so hard it left marks. She did not speak for a long time after I finished. Then she said, very quietly, "He's still our son." And I said, "Yes." And that doesn't change what we do next. The cameras caught nothing for 3 days. Empty rooms, the occasional flicker of our own cleaning lady coming through on her Tuesday visit, nothing worth the fear called in my stomach every time I opened the feed on my phone. Then, on the 4th day, at 2:47 in the afternoon, the driveway camera picked up Kyle's car pulling in, and behind him, a second vehicle, a silver sedan I didn't recognize, driven by a man in a gray suit who I knew. The second I saw his face clearly on the feed, was Gordon Blackwell. They let themselves in with Kyle's key. I watched them move through my own living room on a screen in a motel room 11 miles away, and I want to tell you there is no feeling quite like it, watching two people walk casually through the rooms where you raised your child, discussing, in low, unhurried voices, how to take it all away from you. Blackwell went straight to the small home office off the living room where Norma and I kept our filing cabinet. He tried the drawers, found them locked, a small mercy since I'd started keeping them that way only 2 weeks earlier without fully understanding why, and turned to Kyle with visible irritation. "We need those account statements before the filing goes in," Blackwell said, his voice picked up clean by the kitchen camera's audio pickup, carrying through the open doorway. "Your father moving them off-site was smarter than I gave him credit for. Is there any chance he's on to us?" Kyle's answer, delivered without hesitation, in a tone I will hear in my head for the rest of my life, "No way. Dad's sharp about buildings. He's never once been sharp about people. He trusts everybody who says please and thank you." I paused the recording there. I want you to understand what it does to a man to hear his own son describe him that way, accurately, and use that accuracy as a weapon. I had spent 38 years being the most careful, detail-oriented person in every room I walked into, and my own child had correctly identified the one blind spot capable of costing me everything, that I extended to family the same good faith I'd never once extended to a construction contract. Blackwell moved on to the medication cabinet next, checking the labels on Norma's pill bottles with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before, in other kitchens, in other houses, for other families whose names I did not yet know but would, eventually, come to learn. He noted something on his phone. Then he and Kyle sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd carved my son's initials into the underside as a boy and never told him, and spent 40 minutes discussing what Blackwell called the acceleration plan. I'm not going to walk you through every sentence of that conversation. I'll give you the parts that mattered. "Your mother's episode bought us time, but we're behind on the guardianship petition," Blackwell said. "Ohio took 11 weeks from the first incident to assigned conservatorship. We're already at 3 and we don't even have a competency evaluation scheduled. We need Dr. Renner or someone like her to put something in writing questioning her cognitive baseline. Can Paige get anything from that friend of hers, the one at Cedar Ridge admin?" "She's working on it," Kyle said. "The problem's Dad, not Mom. If we push too hard on Mom's competency, he steps in as her advocate and we lose the whole angle. We need something that puts doubt on both of them at once. Blackwell was quiet for a moment, and then he said the sentence that ended, for me, any last flicker of hope that this could be explained away as some misguided attempt to help. Then we go back to the original plan for him too. Slower. He's bigger, healthier, it'll take longer to establish a pattern, but a man his age falling into a documented decline over 4 or 5 months isn't going to raise flags with anyone. People expect it. We just need patience. I stopped the video. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with my wife beside me, and I understood, with the same cold clarity I used to feel standing under a beam I'd just calculated wouldn't hold, that this was never going to stop on its own. My son had not stumbled into a bad decision. He had married into an operation with a track record, our Ohio family already destroyed behind it, and he had signed on, with open eyes, to do the same thing to his own parents that had apparently been done to at least one other family before us. The next morning I called the one person I trusted enough to bring into this before I brought in the police, an estate attorney named Miriam Castellano who had handled the closing on our house back in 1987 and had stayed, in the loose way small-town professionals do, a distant but reliable presence in our lives ever since. I called her office and told her enough of the truth over the phone that she cleared her afternoon and told me to come in immediately. Miriam's office sat above a hardware store on Founders Street, the kind of building where the stairs creak on the 4th step no matter how carefully you walk. She was 68, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and had the specific quality, I'd noticed it in good engineers and good lawyers alike over the years, of listening to a disaster unfold without a single visible flicker of panic. I laid everything on her desk. The emails, printed. The lab results. The video files, which I'd transferred to a USB drive that afternoon at Priya's shop with her help. Miriam went through every page methodically, and when she finished, she took off her reading glasses, set them down, and said, "Edwin, I need to tell you something Norma told me years ago that I think you need to hear right now." I hadn't expected that. Miriam explained that 8 years earlier, before any of this began, before Kyle had even met Paige, Norma had come to her privately, without telling me, and asked her to set up a small supplemental trust, funded quietly over the years from Norma's own dental hygiene income and a modest inheritance from her mother, entirely separate from our joint estate. "She never told you," Miriam said, "because she said you'd have insisted it wasn't necessary, that Kyle would never do anything to hurt either of you, and she didn't want to have that argument. She wanted a failsafe that existed whether or not either of you ever needed to believe it was necessary." The trust, Miriam told me, held just over $210,000, and its conditions, written into the trust language 8 years earlier in Norma's own careful hand, activated automatically upon documented evidence of financial abuse, coercion, or fraud against either of us. I sat in that office and cried the way men my age don't often let themselves cry in front of other people. My wife, half conscious with a stroke mimicking symptom set caused by the very people we'd trusted to protect her, had quietly protected both of us 8 years before either of us knew we'd need it. "What do we do now?" I asked Miriam, once I could speak again. She laid it out plainly. First, she would file an emergency petition freezing any attempt at guardianship or power of attorney over either Norma or myself, using the medical records and toxicology findings as grounds. Second, she recommended I bring in a private investigator to build a documented, admissible record of what Blackwell and Page's operation had done in Ohio and possibly elsewhere, since pattern evidence would matter enormously if this ever reached a courtroom. And third, this was the part that made my stomach drop all over again, she recommended, gently, that I consider going to the police now rather than later, because what I was describing had moved well past family fraud and into attempted murder by poison, a felony that would not wait patiently while I gathered more proof. I asked for 48 hours before we brought in law enforcement. I wanted, selfishly, one more piece of the picture. I wanted to understand exactly how far my son had already gone, and exactly how much he understood about what he'd agreed to. Miriam, against her better professional judgment, gave me those 48 hours, on the condition that I not confront anyone directly and that I bring in a licensed investigator that same day. The investigator's name was Ray Delgado. Miriam had used him on 2 prior estate fraud cases and vouched for him without reservation. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, built like a man who'd spent 20 years doing something physical before switching to something quieter, with the unhurried patience of someone who has learned that most people eventually tell you everything if you let them talk long enough. I met him at a diner on the edge of town, and I told him the whole story, start to finish, the way I'd told Miriam, while he took notes in handwriting so small and precise it looked almost like code. 3 months, Ray said, when I finished. Maybe less. Frank, sorry, Gordon Blackwell, whatever his real name is, men like him don't stay in one place long once a job's done. If there's an Ohio victim, there's probably others between here and there. I can start pulling public filings on Heritage Family Advisors tomorrow morning. If they've registered any LLCs, filed any liens, anything at all, it'll be in a county clerk's office somewhere, and I know how to find it faster than most. Ray worked fast. Within 5 days he'd confirmed that Heritage Family Advisors had no legitimate business registration in our state at all, the name existed only on a website and a stack of business cards. He'd traced Renata Vale, the name page used in her early correspondence with Blackwell, back through 2 prior aliases, one of which matched a woman named Denise Ferris who had briefly married an elderly widower in a small town outside Columbus 4 years earlier, before disappearing with a substantial portion of his savings following what county records listed, without further explanation, as an unresolved competency proceeding. The widower, Ray learned through a contact at the Ohio courthouse, had died 11 months after the ordeal, his family blaming, in a brief and heartbreaking obituary notice, the stress of recent months for a heart that simply gave out. We had a name now. Or names, plural, Paige Calloway, Denise Ferris, Renata Vale, 3 faces belonging to what was very likely the same woman, married or engaged to at least 2 men in 2 different states inside of 5 years, each time positioning herself close to an aging, trusting family with money worth taking. The 48 hours I'd asked Miriam for stretched, with her cautious blessing, into 10 days, because every day brought Ray a new thread worth pulling. On the 7th day, working off a tip from the Ohio courthouse contact, Ray obtained a photograph, a grainy but unmistakable image from a wedding 4 years earlier, in which the bride, listed in the caption as Denise Ferris, was undeniably Paige. On the 9th day, Priya, working through the browsing history and cached files on Kyle's laptop during another visit I'd arranged under the pretense of returning a forgotten charger, found a folder labeled simply Docs containing draft guardianship petition language, a template power of attorney form with my name and Norma's already filled in and only the signature lines left blank, and the discovery that finally moved me to call the police that same evening, a handwritten note, photographed and saved to the cloud, in Blackwell's handwriting, that read: If competency route stalls past 90 days, revert to insurance angle on both policies. Talk to K-Re, timeline pressure, no later than mid-fall. Insurance angle. I sat with Ray in his cramped little office that evening and asked him, my voice barely holding steady, what that phrase could possibly mean, and Ray, to his credit, did not soften it for me. It means, he said, that somewhere in this plan, there's a version where neither you nor Norma survives it, and somebody collects on a policy instead of waiting on a guardianship court. I think it's time, Edwin. Past time. I called Detective Lauren Whitfield the next morning, a name Miriam had given me from a prior case, a woman who'd built a career specializing in elder financial exploitation cases for the county sheriff's office. I told her everything on the phone, and she asked me to come in that same afternoon with every piece of documentation I had. I brought Ray's files, Miriam's legal filings, the toxicology report, the video footage from our own home, and the folder Priya had pulled from Kyle's laptop. Detective Whitfield went through all of it at her desk with the same unhurried, unshockable patience I'd come to recognize in every professional I'd brought into this, Miriam, Ray, Priya, the particular calm of people who have seen enough of the worst of human nature that they no longer waste energy being surprised by it, only energy doing something about it. "Mr. Marsh," she said, when she finished, "I want to be straight with you. What you've handed me is more complete than most cases I see after 6 months of investigation. But I need to bring in the state's financial crimes unit, because if this Ohio connection is real, we may be looking at interstate fraud, which means federal jurisdiction could apply. And Mr. Marsh, the poison. I don't say that word lightly. If the toxicology holds up under independent review, and I believe it will, we are talking about attempted murder charges against your son and his wife. I need you to understand the size of what's about to happen to your family before we take one more step." I told her I understood. I did not really, not yet. Understanding a thing like that takes longer than a single sentence in a detective's office. Whitfield's plan, worked out over the following 4 days in coordination with Miriam and a state financial crimes investigator named Agent Renata Cho, no relation to the alias Page had used, a coincidence that unsettled me more than it should have, involved one final piece of evidence they needed before an arrest, a recorded conversation, obtained with my consent as one of the parties present. That would put Kyle and Page's intentions in their own voices, on their own initiative, without any prompting from law enforcement. Whitfield explained that our state allowed one-party consent recording, meaning that if I wore a wire during a conversation I was part of, everything captured would be fully admissible in court. "We want to give them a reason to talk openly," Whitfield said. "Something that makes them believe the window's closing and they need to move fast. Fear makes people careless. Careless people say things out loud." We settled on a plan that made my chest tight every time I thought about it in the days leading up to it. I would call Kyle and tell him, in a voice carefully coached by Whitfield's team to sound weary and defeated rather than suspicious, that Norma and I had been talking, and that after everything, the stress, the hospital, feeling like we couldn't manage the house or our finances the way we used to, we'd decided it might be time to let him and Paige help more formally. I would invite them to dinner to talk through the paperwork Gordon mentioned. Miriam warned me, more than once, that this was the single riskiest moment in the entire plan, because if Kyle sensed anything false in my voice, the whole operation could collapse and Blackwell's people could disappear before charges were ever filed. I made the call on a Thursday evening, sitting at my own kitchen table with a small recording device taped beneath my collar and Detective Whitfield's number already dialed and silently connected on a second phone in my lap, per her instructions, so her team could listen live from a surveillance van parked 2 streets over. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since your mother's hospital stay," I said, and I let my voice do the thing Whitfield's coach had shown me, let it sag with a tiredness that wasn't entirely faked, because underneath the performance there was a real exhaustion, for months deep, that I didn't have to reach far to find. "I think your mother and I need help managing things. More than we've been willing to admit. Gordon mentioned some paperwork a while back. Would you and Paige and Gordon want to come by Sunday evening? I think it's time we sat down as a family and got this handled." There was a pause on the line, 2 seconds, maybe 3, the kind of pause a man takes when he's recalculating everything he thought he knew about the conversation he's having. Then Kyle's voice came back, warm, careful, and underneath the warmth, unmistakably, relief. "Dad, that means a lot." "Yeah. We'll all be there. I love you." "I love you too, son," I said, and I want you to know that sentence was not a lie, even in the middle of everything else that was. That is the particular cruelty of a story like this one. You can love someone completely and still have to build a case against them. Sunday arrived with a strange, suspended stillness, the kind of quiet that settles over a house before a storm nobody outside can see coming yet. Detective Whitfield's team spent the afternoon at our house under the cover of helping us prepare a family meal, installing additional recording equipment throughout the dining room and living room, positioning 2 unmarked units 2 blocks away, and briefing me one final time on the small handful of prompts I needed to guide the conversation toward, if I could, without pushing so hard that Kyle or Paige grew suspicious. Miriam arrived at 4:30 in a plain cardigan, introduced to anyone who asked as an old family friend. Ray Delgado came separately, parking 3 houses down and walking over on foot, positioned to watch the front windows from our neighbor's porch, with our neighbor's blessing, in case anyone tried to leave early. Norma sat beside me at the head of our dining table that evening in the navy dress she'd worn to our 40th anniversary dinner, her hand steady, though I could feel, every time our fingers brushed under the table, that they were steady only because she was making them be. I want to be in the room when it happens, she'd told me 3 days earlier, and I hadn't had it in me to argue with her. Kyle and Paige arrived at 6:20, Gordon Blackwell pulling up in his silver sedan 4 minutes behind them. Kyle hugged me at the door with an ease that turned my stomach, said the house smelled wonderful, said he'd missed us. Paige kissed Norma's cheek and told her she looked wonderful for someone who'd been through so much, and I watched my wife smile back at her with a warmth that must have cost her everything she had left. Blackwell shook my hand with the same practiced, professional grip I imagined he'd used in a dozen other kitchens, in a dozen other houses, on a dozen other trusting old men, and said he was honored to be included in such an important family conversation. We ate for the better part of an hour. Kyle talked about work. Paige asked Norma gentle, probing questions about how she was feeling, whether her memory had been any clearer lately, questions I understood now were not concern but reconnaissance. Blackwell said little, watching, the way a man watches a room he expects to own by the end of the evening. At 7:40, I set down my fork and reached for the folder I'd placed on the sideboard behind me, 3 printed pages, enough to open the conversation without revealing the full weight of what waited behind them. I want to talk about the paperwork, I said, and the table went quiet in the particular way a table goes quiet when everyone at it senses the evening is about to change shape. Of course, Blackwell said smoothly, already reaching for his own briefcase. I brought the documents we discussed. Power of attorney, updated beneficiary designations, a simple trust restructuring that protects. Before we sign anything, I said, I want to understand something. Gordon, how long have you known my daughter-in-law? The pause that followed lasted only a second, but I watched it land on his face, watched the practiced warmth flicker the way a fluorescent bulb flickers right before it dies. We met professionally, through her work in the estate consulting field. Why do you ask? Because I have a photograph, I said, sliding the first page across the table, from a wedding in Ohio 4 years ago. The bride's name on the caption is Denise Ferris. I think you'll agree the resemblance to Paige is difficult to explain away as coincidence. Paige's face did not crumble the way I'd imagined it might, in the 100 versions of this moment I'd rehearsed in my head over the preceding weeks. It went smooth instead, flat, a mask settling into place with practiced speed. Kyle looked at her, then at the photograph, then back at her, his own face moving through confusion into something closer to dawning horror. Paige, he said quietly, what is this? Don't, Paige said, and her voice had changed entirely, gone cold and clipped in a way I hadn't heard from her in 18 months of Sunday dinners. Don't say anything else, Kyle. Second, I said, sliding the next page across, I have a lab report showing elevated potassium and evidence of sustained oversupplementation in Norma's system, dating back at least 8 weeks. Dr. Okafor has already flagged it in her chart and reported it to the State Medical Board's abuse unit. I watched Kyle's hands, flat against the table, begin to tremble. And third, I said, my voice, to my own surprise, not breaking at all, I have an email, Kyle, from you, describing the dosing timeline. Your own words. Slow enough that Dr. Okafor writes it off as age. Kyle stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. Dad, I can explain, it wasn't, we weren't trying to hurt her, I swear to you, it was never. Sit down, Miriam said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her before, quiet and absolutely immovable, and Kyle sat, because some instinct in him, even now, still recognized an authority worth obeying. Blackwell's composure cracked next, and it cracked into something uglier than either Kyle's or Paige's had, not fear, but calculation, his eyes moving fast around the room, toward the front door, toward the kitchen, toward every exit a man who has done this before knows to map the moment he walks into a house. I think, he said, standing, reaching for his briefcase, that this conversation has run its course. Kyle, Paige, we should. Sit down, Mr. Blackwell, I said. Or should I call you by the name on your actual license, if you have one at all? That's when I pulled out my phone and played, for the whole table, 41 seconds of the recording Norma and I had captured through our own kitchen camera 3 weeks earlier, Blackwell and Kyle, sitting at this very table, discussing timeline pressure, discussing the acceleration plan, discussing what would happen to me if the guardianship petition stalled too long. Nobody said anything while it played. Kyle put his head in his hands. Norma's grip on my hand under the table tightened until it hurt, and I let it, because I understood, in that moment, exactly what it was costing her to sit still and listen to her son's voice describe a plan to slowly poison his own father. When the recording ended, I nodded toward the front hallway, and the front door opened before anyone at the table had time to process what was happening. Detective Whitfield came through first, badge raised, followed by 2 uniformed officers and Agent Cho close behind. Kyle Marsh, Paige Calloway, or Denise Ferris, or Renata Vale, whichever name you're using tonight, and you, sir, Whitfield said, looking at Blackwell, you're all under arrest. Blackwell made a single sharp movement toward the back door before one of the officers had him against the wall, cuffs on, in under 4 seconds. Paige didn't move at all, didn't say a word, her face gone entirely blank, the same practiced stillness I imagined she'd worn in Ohio, and wherever else this had happened before, when the cost of being caught finally arrived. Kyle looked at me across the table as they pulled his arms behind his back, and he said one thing, his voice cracking apart around the words. Dad. I'm sorry. I never wanted her to get hurt, I swear, Blackwell said it would go slow, he said it would be gentle, he said nobody would even. There's no gentle version of what you did to your mother, I said, and I want you to know that was the last full sentence I spoke to my son for a very long time. The door closed behind the last officer at 8:53 that evening, and the house went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the same sound it must have made every night for 38 years while none of us noticed it at all. Norma put her head against my shoulder and cried in a way I had never once seen her cry, not at her own mother's funeral, not at the loss of the dog under the maple tree, and I held her and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that either of us could bear to hear out loud. If you're still with me, comment the word truth below, because the story doesn't end there, and I want to know you're still here for what comes next. The months that followed moved with a strange, dragging weight. Ray Delgado's Ohio contact confirmed, within 2 weeks, that the widower's family Paige had targeted for years earlier was willing to speak with investigators, and their statement, combined with a second, previously unreported case Detective Whitfield's team uncovered in a neighboring county, an elderly widow named Frances Odom who had lost nearly $300,000 to a man matching Blackwell's description 18 months before he ever set foot in our lives, turned what began as a single family's ordeal into a multi-state financial crimes investigation. Agent Cho's team, working alongside the state's Attorney General's office, eventually connected Blackwell, whose real name turned out to be Douglas Renner Prescott, a man with 2 prior fraud convictions under different aliases in 2 other states, to a pattern going back at least 7 years and touching, as far as investigators could ultimately confirm, no fewer than 5 families. I sat through a grand jury proceeding that October and testified for nearly 3 hours, walking the jurors through every document, every timestamp, every recording, the same way I had once walked insurance investigators through a collapsed retaining wall, methodically, without embellishment, letting the evidence carry its own weight. Kyle was indicted on charges including attempted murder, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Page, the state ultimately charged her under the name Denise Renee Ferris, since her actual birth certificate, recovered eventually from a record search in a small Kentucky county, bore a name none of us had ever heard her use, faced those same charges plus additional counts tied to the Ohio and county cases. Prescott, whose real criminal history stretched back further than anyone initially realized, faced the heaviest charges of the 3, including racketeering. The trial began the following February, in a courtroom that felt, on the first morning, impossibly small for the size of what had happened inside my own kitchen. I testified again, this time in front of a jury of 12 strangers who would decide what my son's life looked like for the next several decades. I want to tell you that watching Kyle at the defense table, thinner than I remembered, his suit hanging loose at the shoulders the way clothes hang on a man who has stopped sleeping and mostly stopped eating, did not soften anything in me. That would be a lie, and this story has cost me enough honesty already that I won't spend the last of it lying to you now. It softened something. It just didn't change what I had to do. Kyle's attorney tried, on cross-examination, to paint the picture Blackwell's attorney had already tried and would try again in the following weeks, that my son was a victim too, manipulated by a woman and a con artist who had targeted him precisely because he was vulnerable, still healing from a decade of failure, desperate to believe someone finally saw something worth investing in. I understood, sitting on that witness stand, that there was truth buried somewhere inside that argument. I understood it, and I still answered every question honestly, because the truth of Kyle's vulnerability did not erase the truth of the email he'd written in his own hand, describing a dosing timeline for his own mother's medication, with language that made clear he understood, at least in broad strokes, exactly what he was agreeing to. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, Kyle was convicted on all but one of the charges against him. The jury found reasonable doubt on the most serious attempted murder count specific to intent, accepting, apparently, that he had genuinely believed the dosing was meant only to create documented decline rather than to kill, though they convicted him on the lesser charges of conspiracy, financial exploitation, and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to 11 years, with the possibility of parole after 7. Page, Denise, Renata, whatever name belonged to the real woman underneath all of them, was convicted on every count, including the full attempted murder charge, the jury unmoved by a defense built almost entirely on blaming Blackwell for orchestrating a plan she had, in fact, helped design and had run at least twice before under other names. She received 22 years. Prescott, tried separately given the scope of his prior history, received the longest sentence of the 3, 28 years, with the judge noting for the record that his pattern of targeting isolated, aging couples across multiple states represented, in her words, a sustained and calculated predation that this court has rarely seen replicated with such cold efficiency. I sat in the courtroom the day all 3 sentences were read, Norma's hand in mine, and I did not feel the relief I had imagined I would feel back when this started, back in a hospital hallway with a nurse telling me my son had asked her not to call me. I felt something quieter than relief. Something closer to the specific stillness that comes after a structure you've spent months bracing finally, stops moving. Norma made a full recovery, physically, within about 6 months, though the doctors told us the elevated potassium exposure had likely contributed to some mild, permanent changes in her heart rhythm that we manage now with medication and regular monitoring, a quiet, daily reminder neither of us ever fully stops feeling. We sold the house on Larkspur Lane the following spring, not because we'd stopped loving it, but because every room in it had become, for a while, a place where we half expected to see something we didn't want to see on a camera feed that no longer existed. We bought a smaller place 2 towns over, closer to Priya's shop and Miriam's office, closer to the small handful of people who had, when it mattered most, refused to let either of us fight this alone. I visit Kyle twice a month, at the facility 3 hours from our new home. I won't pretend those visits are easy, or that I know, even now, exactly how to be his father across a visitation room table, watching the years take something out of his face that I'm not sure will ever fully come back. But I go, because Norma taught me something in the middle of all of this that I didn't fully understand until it was over, that holding someone accountable and refusing to abandon them are not opposite instincts. They can live in the same chest at the same time, the way grief and love learn to live together in mine. I do not visit Paige, and I have not spoken to her, and I don't expect that to change. Some doors, once you understand what's actually on the other side of them, are better left closed. If this story has taught me anything worth passing on to you tonight, it's this. Trust your instincts the moment they flicker, even when, especially when, they flicker about someone you love. I sat on my own porch drinking sweet tea, watching my son laugh again for the first time in a decade, and I let that gratitude talk me out of noticing every small, careful question his wife asked about our finances, our health, our plans. Gratitude is not evidence. Love is not proof of safety. The people who mean us harm rarely look like strangers. Most of the time, they look exactly like the people we've spent our whole lives learning to trust without question, and that is precisely why they're so dangerous, and precisely why the moment something in your gut says the wall isn't carrying its load the way it should, you owe it to yourself, and to the people you love, to go find out why. Document everything. I did not catch any of this because I was smarter than my son or the people he married into. I caught it because I wrote dates down in a notebook before I even understood what I was writing them down for, and because 38 years of a career spent looking for the real cause behind a visible crack taught me not to accept the first explanation anyone hands me, especially when that explanation comes wrapped in a warm hug and an easy laugh. Build your own team before you need one. I could not have done any of this alone, and I want to be honest that I nearly tried to. Priya's patience with a laptop. Miriam's steady hand with the law. Ray's relentless willingness to follow one small thread until it became an entire rope. Detective Whitfield's refusal to treat an old man's fear as an old man's confusion. None of them were family by blood, and every one of them showed up, in the end, more faithfully than the family I'd spent 41 years believing would never need watching. And last, if there's one thing I hope you carry out of this story tonight, it's this: growing older does not make you weak, and it does not make you foolish, no matter what anyone standing to profit from your trust might try to convince you of. It makes you experienced. It makes you the only person in the room who has seen enough of life to recognize the shape of a lie before it fully forms. I spent 38 years finding the hidden weakness in structures other people trusted completely. I nearly missed the one hiding in my own kitchen. I am telling you all of this so that you don't have to learn it the same way I did, standing in a hospital hallway, being told by a stranger that your own son had already decided, before you ever walked through the door, that you didn't need to know your wife was in danger at all. Thank you for staying with me through all of this tonight. If this story moved you, if any part of it made you think of someone in your own life worth checking in on, leave a comment and let me know what stayed with you most. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. These stories exist because people like you keep showing up to hear them, and every single one of you who stays until the end makes the next story worth telling. One final note before I let you go: certain names, timelines, and details in this account have been adapted or dramatized for storytelling purposes, in keeping with the nature of this kind of narrated story. If that isn't the kind of content you enjoy, I understand completely, and I hope you'll find something else tonight that suits you better. For everyone else, thank you for walking through this one with me. It means more than you probably know. Kyle answered on the second ring. Dad, hey. Everything okay?